these are all important contributions to some of the most difficult problems in the philosophy of the social sciences, the foundations, really, of the social sciences. I feel that the 6 papers together really serve as kind of data points in the large map of where social science imagination needs to be moving. And therefore, I think that today's sessions are really very, very important. What I thought I might do in the 15 minutes allotted to me is to give you at least a little bit of a sketch of what I think the terrain is into which these 3 papers can be fixed. But also, I think it actually works for the papers in the morning as well. First of all, why do we have an interest in the philosophy of social science, or for that matter, the history of the social sciences? Why is it an interesting topic? It is interesting because there's a big way in which the social sciences are an enormous failure. I'm sorry to bring that news to you. It's partly a failure because of positivism and because of an associated doctrine, which is naturalism, the idea that science is science, and we had some really great examples in chemistry and physics, and now let's get on with it with sociology and economics. And the implicit assumption that social science thinking, social science reasoning, social science methodology should look an awful lot like the methodology in physics and chemistry. And that is a profound and profoundly misleading error. It's an error because the social world is not at all like the natural world. It's composed of the natural world, but it doesn't work in the same way. And so if we were to imagine that the things of the social world ought to be like, big protein protein molecules or something like that, and then we can kind of discover what the intermolecular forces are which make them do various things, that's just the wrong way to think about the social world. The really hard part of the story is what's next. If naturalism and positivism are not the right ways of proceeding for the social world, and by the way, the stakes are incredibly high. If we are not better at doing social science, then we will also not be better at doing the kind of thing that Joy was talking about, which is good social policy and the design of social policy and the solution of major social problems. So the stakes are very high. We need a better social science. We need a better sociology. And we're on the wrong path if we try to take models which were maybe very good models, maybe not so good models for physics and chemistry, and then say, well, that's what sociology ought to look like. So one thing which holds all 3 of these papers and all 3 of the earlier papers together is a demand for a post-positivist approach to the social sciences. And I certainly endorse that. I think that it's absolutely crucial that we come up with a new lexicon, with new models and metaphors and ways of thinking about the social world, which allow us then to ask a new set of questions, not questions that would come out of survey research or the kind of quantitative research projects which we talked about a little bit in the first session, but to ask new questions about interpretation, causation, heterogeneity, complexity. The social world really needs to be understood in its fullness, its complexity, and its contingency in a way that the social sciences, up until this time, have not been very good at doing. So that's point number 1. It's really important to have a better philosophy of the social sciences, a philosophical understanding of where we are in the social sciences and where we need to go. This takes me to the idea that it's really important that we have imaginative social scientists and philosophers doing the work of kind of reimagining the nature of the social world in a way which is more adequate to what we really kind of intuitively understand about the social world in the first place. I was really happy that Claire began her paper by talking about heterogeneity and the really, I would say, fundamental fact, the fundamental ontological fact of heterogeneity of social things. We make a huge mistake when we use nouns like Islam or capitalism or the liberal state, and we think we're referring to one thing. No, all of those nouns capture a huge range of different structures, value systems, causal processes, configurations of actors doing various kinds of things. And so getting the idea of heterogeneity into one's head in realizing that in doing social science research, we should really be looking for variation and possibly then the causes of variation. That brings us back to a more explanatory set of questions. But to give up the kind of naturalistic assumption that there ought to be things in the social world which can be studied as homogeneous bodies of entities, kind of like biology or taxonomy or something. Give that idea up, recognize the social world is deeply heterogeneous. Another impulse which is expressed in Claire's paper is the idea of contingency, and the idea that social processes are not determined processes. They're not like chemical reactions which just kind of unfold according to a fixed set of chemical laws. No, they are actor-generated outcomes. And the really hard problem for social science research is to identify, well, critical realists want to put it in terms of causal mechanisms. I think that's one good language. But there are other vocabulary, other pieces of vocabulary that could be used to try to kind of disaggregate that question. What does that contingency amount to? Why is it that fascism, Michael Mann's analysis of fascism, why did fascism unfold in the ways that it did in Italy, Romania, and Germany, but not in France and Great Britain? There were fascist tendencies in all of those places, and so there's a contingency that needs to be understood. If we were just to say, with the aleatory Althusser, well, it's just a swerve, some of those instances swerved away from fascism, that's not very satisfactory. We would like to understand what are some of the causal mechanisms, what are some of the path-dependent occurrences or events which occurred, which led to non-fascism in France and deep fascism in, let's say, Spain. So getting on top of the idea that social things are never going to be reduced to this kind of comfortable set of generalizations, a very positivistic conception of what scientific knowledge should lead us to, not going to lead us to a fixed set of necessary and sufficient conditions, which is what all and only fascist regimes have, or liberal states have, or instances of the extreme right mobilization in different countries. Any social term that you pick out, it's going to look different in different social settings. My second point, why philosophy? What is philosophy of social science all about? Well, one of the things which is illustrated and I think really underlined, emphasized by critical realism is that we really need to shift from what has been the primary emphasis of the philosophy of science, which is epistemology. How do we know about the empirical world? To a prior question, ontology. What actually are we thinking of when we ask what is a molecule in the natural sciences, or what is a social class, what is an institution? We need to have a better vocabulary. We need to have better thinking about the nature of social things. And again, for both Tim and Claire, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about their papers is that they're exercising imagination, that they're making use of the ideas of various people who have not been put, at least in the mainstream of sociological thinking, to try to find some concepts which work a little better for kind of conceptualizing and describing what these kind of underlying social processes or social entities, social constructs are. So ontology is really I would say it is one of the primary focus areas of critical realism. Coming up with a better way of capturing what the social world consists of and what kinds of things we're interested or we would even be able to empirically investigate in the social realm. There has been a period of time when I've wanted to just stop using, in fact, I think Latour said this before me, that we shouldn't talk about society, or we should not reify like social structures. What is a social structure? What is a social relation? We should be really cautious in making use of these kind of collective terms like society. Instead, we should try to come up with a better lexicon, a better set of ideas about what these underlying things might be. So ontology, epistemology, methodology. This brings me to Liz's paper, because Liz is really talking about the link between a philosophical idea of value-free science and the topic of how do we do good scientific research about human subjects. I don't mean literally human subjects, but subjects having to do with human behavior, basically. Methodology, in other words. what are the implications of philosophy of science for the doing of methodology? Liz's particular issue is, can we give a more adequate understanding of the relationship between values and facts in the social realm? And your case is completely compelling to me. I think you've solved that problem. It is interesting to me that Walsh and Putnam have, on the basis of a very different kind of reasoning, but a very similar conclusion, that you simply can't separate out value assertions and factual assertions, that you just have to understand these things go together. The really hard question is the question which you raised. How do you keep epistemology in this? How do you keep kind of rational evaluation of hypotheses and theories? And I think, again, I think you did just a great job of explicating that. But methodology can be informed by values. It also can be informed by ontology. I've asked myself in my blog, mentioned here in the bio, does ontology make a difference for methodology? Or does studying critical realism lead to a different kind of sociological research? And my opinion is that it does. That in kind of concrete ways, if you have a positivist understanding of what a good scientific finding is, then you will be led to design a research agenda which is structured around that idea of what the ideal scientific product is. If you think, as the critical realists do, that really the really important object of scientific scrutiny is unobservable underlying causal mechanisms, then you will ask a very different set of questions. And so methodology is influenced by ontological thinking. You will ask different questions, and then you will possibly evaluate the answers that you come to differently according to whether you think there are underlying causal mechanisms, or you think really it's all kind of surface regularities and observable regularities. So my basic appreciation of these papers is we need more and broader imagination, and we need a broader palette, really, of concepts to use in the social sciences. Assemblage, Tim has been working hard on the question of the relationship between assemblage theory and critical realism. Some people might say, you've got to choose one or the other. You're either going down the road of critical realism and objective underlying causes, or you're doing a more flaky kind of French philosophy. What Tim has been trying to demonstrate is that these things are not so separate, that it is possible to give a realist interpretation of the idea of assemblage. And I think that's a really, really constructive effort to make. The concept of assemblage works really well for the idea of heterogeneity, because it kind of accounts for how it could be that being Muslim in America is such a different thing in Dearborn or in Kansas City or in Los Angeles, that being Muslim is not just one thing. It's not like sprinkle the Muslim salt and you get Muslimness. It is rather a whole complex assemblage of institutions, local practices. I have observed on the Dearborn campus, for example, that Muslim women, we have about the same number of Muslim women on our campus that we had when I first arrived 16, 17 years ago, but the percentage of women who wear hijab has gone up dramatically. In other words, there's been a real shift in the kind of symbol of slightly more traditional expression of being a female Muslim person. Well, that is itself an object of sociological study, or a possible object of sociological study, and it might be very different than a university in Los Angeles. So this kind of overlaying of practices and styles and underlying kind of religious ideas, and some people believe on my campus that Muslim women are encouraged by their families to come to my campus because it's a more containable campus, and therefore they will be, quote, safer. Well, that's a very particular thing, a very historically conditioned thing, exactly as Claire was saying. I came up with a little list of people whose work I think is very, kind of satisfies the demand I'm making for more imagination, more creativity in the social sciences. The pragmatism term, I think, is hugely important, and I think, again, for Tim and for Liz, that's an important term in the social sciences. I think it's important in a couple of different ways, different levels of social science framing, but maybe most important is in the theory of the actor. Because pragmatism gives us a very different way of understanding actor from, a kind of more Aristotelian, goal-directed rationality, whether it's rational choice theory or other more liberalized forms of actors. Pragmatism gives us a different way of thinking about the actor, which is less kind of rational, intentional, but not for that reason irrational. So it's an important way of kind of thinking differently about the nature of the actor, and I think it's an important thing to explore. And I think Liz, you were saying that it's one of the things you're really excited about pragmatism. So those are a couple of new currents, and they're both a part of Tim's paper. But maybe I'll give you one third example that I find exciting, and maybe people in this room will not agree with me, but Fligstein and McAdam and strategic action fields as a different way of thinking about social structures, organizations, the kind of enduring or semi-enduring kind of middle level of social entities. And the idea that we should not reify social entities. We shouldn't say, well, IBM, that's a bureaucracy and it's a corporation, so now we know what it is. Instead, we should understand it as a system, a strategic action field system, in which we can do real empirical research to see what the relationships of communication and authority and collaboration and the flow of information and so forth. By doing that work, I think that's a very different way of thinking about social institutions, social organizations. The French sociologist Crozier seems to have a very similar view, but 20 years earlier. So it's a kind of interesting convergence. Well, I think I've talked enough. I have no idea how long I've talked, but I have the sense it was long enough. I'll just close by saying really very, very fine contributions to a very big problem set, of which we've got now 6 kind of points on the graph, but all 6 were really stimulating to me, and I think it's been a terrific contribution, so thank you.